Welcome to the Cultist Cast. I will be your chief bishop officiator. Eventually, I actually do need to put more thought into the fake titles we make for this.
Like maybe Archbishop.
Yeah, like a sort of like a Catholic adjacent terminology. I'm joined by Sam. Brother Samael. Oh. And
Part of me wanted to try to call himself a high priest, but another part of me wanted to just intentionally railroad the wrong, like high constable.
And on this episode of the Cultist Cast, we're going to be talking about Lex Luthor in general, but specifically sort of like Jesse Eisenberg, the story that was being set up. We're going to talk about what he did in the two movies we got of him, what he was originally intended to do there and beyond, according to the Jim Lee storyboards and all that, which isn't what if Zack, like, tomorrow woke up and was in charge of DC again. He wouldn't adapt those. He's already said that he rewrote them while working on Justice League. So he changed them because he basically was like, well, now you guys would know what would happen. Which I think is kind of fun. Like,
That's nice.
We're also going to talk about just generally why people seem sort of upset. And I think we'll sort of start there because I have this sort of conspiracy theory, as you will. Which, I mean, if we're not going to talk about conspiracies on the Cultist Cast, then do we even deserve to do our blood sacrifices at night?
In slow-mo.
In slow motion. Shirtless, slow motion, virgin goat sacrifices. And let me tell you...
The goats have to be shirtless as well.
And jacked. So I have this opinion that I think one of the reasons that people sort of reacted negatively towards Jesse's interpretation, or I guess sort of Chris Terrio and Zack Snyder's interpretation that Jesse portrayed, was the fact that he wasn't this sort of Giga Chad dude bro anymore, and as much as...
His character is very different from what we're used to seeing.
A little bit, but like having really enjoyed Smallville when I was in high school, that guy was a skinny nerd. Like, yeah, he had the Porsche, right, and he was like rich, and he was kind of like... He was the 2000s version of a rich kid. Like, I could have imagined seeing him next to, like, Snooki or Britney Spears at, like, a red carpet event in the 2000s. Like, he had the vibe, and it worked for the story they were telling. But it's not based on any specific comic. Like, he's not normally BFFs with Clark at a young age. It's a compelling element for a show, but it's not usually part of the comics. And you were pointing out, you mentioned the comic book, I forget the title or exactly what it was, but there's a comic where instead of it being Lex that's there, it's like a young Bruce Wayne, his car breaks down and then he plays baseball.
Yeah, they're like, I think it's like a limo that Alfred's driving that's breaks down. While he's fixing the tire, he hangs out with a young Clark Kent. Yeah,
and he's like, he thanks John for helping fix everything. He's like, I haven't seen Bruce basically be a little kid in a while. And, you know, you planted that in my head, and I'm like, man, a Smallville-style show or story where it's just young Bruce and young Clark having that friendship where neither one fully tells the other one their secret.
And I love the fact that in just their little play fight, Bruce's, like, internal dialogue is like, I can tell he's holding back. He's not fighting with all of his strength.
But anyway, back to Lex. I do want to, I think it's important to point out, I don't remember if we have that up anymore. I'll have to look for it. We did a different video like over a year ago, maybe 2 years ago now, where I went through all the people who almost played the Justice League members. And Adam Driver was Zack Snyder's first pick for Lex Luthor in Batman vs. Superman. Rumors said he was going to be Nightwing. It turns out later on he was like, no, I was auditioning for Lex, but I was also auditioning for Kylo Ren, and I went with Star Wars. And I think if you imagine Adam Driver doing the Jesse Eisenberg stuff, like, it still fits, and he's a sort of a middle ground between the two.
I think he could have thread the
and he's jacked in real life. He former Marine. He can.
I think
jacked.
He could have probably thread the line of what people expected versus what they got a bit more, but you know.
But at the same time, I have fallen so in love with the way like Jesse's maniacal, just like. He looks like he's constantly... The look on his face in his, like, speech with Superman up on the helipad in Batman vs. Superman, when he thinks he's won, he's like, I'm smarter than everyone. I tricked the world. I gotcha. He has this, like, shit-eating, like, sociopathic look on his face where he's just almost, like, vibrating with joy. He's like, he won and he's smart. And he's smarter than you. And it's just... so good that I don't think like a reserved Lex would have worked for that story. Because we get that in Justice League, like the little teaser. It's like after Arkham, which is a great story thing of like he goes to Arkham and Arkham legitimately helps him become more focused, which makes him more dangerous.
Yeah, and I think we had this conversation, I can't remember if it was recorded or not, but like the idea that the reason he acts so like odd and strange, it literally looks like he's practically having a breakdown mid-speech on a stage.
Yeah.
Is because like he's so smart, his brain is like breaking.
Yeah, he's like an overclocked PC, and it's like his components can't keep up with how incredibly fast he can compute. And almost every line of dialogue he has 2 or 3 meanings to it. He says the senator's going to be in the hot seat before he blows her up.
Mm-hmm.
And my favorite in that speech where he's having the meltdown, he says a humanitarian is, someone, and I haven't seen the movie for like a couple months now, so forgive me for my not exactness, but he basically says someone who is like a lover of humanity, and it sounds like, oh, he loves humanity. He's like, no, I only love humanity. Like, it's a different context when you know that he hates Superman, and it's so, God, it's, Chris Terrio is like, he's like actually Russell Crowe from A Beautiful Mind. I don't know how he writes that stuff. He's diabolical. But yeah, my theory is that, we say that Lex Luthor is a villain, but historically for like the last 40 or so years, he's been written usually as a very strong, like big, like he looks like the Chad meme got shaved, and he's rich as hell. And he usually is able to, he's basically Batman without the Batsuit. Like he has the cyber suit sometimes, and he makes gadgets. I would consider him almost
like an evil Iron Man.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty apt description. And, we say, oh, he's the bad guy, but he does have traits that through society, and you can argue and debate whether or not this is a good thing or a bad thing. I believe all things in moderation. But the idea of being a successful businessman who's jacked, that a lot of people do want to be what Lex appears to be in most fiction.
And I will say a good example of like what Lex contributes from a perspective. There are 2 examples I can think of. One is the finale of Justice League Unlimited, where he actually like solves the problem.
Yeah, he like solves anti-life.
Yeah, and like shows it to
Clancy
Darkseid.
Brown was phenomenal. That whole series is phenomenal. And
then the other one is in Superman Red Son, where he defeats Superman with just like an envelope.
Yeah, with a note. What does it say? It's like if you...
Why don't you just put the whole world in a bottle?
Yeah.
Which just basically tells him like, you're trying to control the world. You're just like Brainiac. You're just like the person you had to stop that destroyed your planet, and like you now only have one remnant of your home left.
I think that is like... Red Son is a great example of even a broken clock is right twice a day, because Mark Millar is a horrific person, terrible writer, edgelord in real life. To quote Grant Morrison in an interview, the interviewer said, oh, you live in Scotland like Mark Millar, any chance of you running into him? And Grant Morrison, the absolute Chad, said, yeah, there's a possibility, and if I'm lucky, I'll be going 100 miles an hour. Grant Morrison. Man. My favorite
Isn't
New 52.
One of the writers on New 52 Batman?
I know the Grant Morrison's New 52 Superman was like the one where Superman's got the T-shirt on and he like lands with the glowing eyes, like rats with like, and he starts monologuing like a villain to instill fear into like the hyper rich people, and then he like drops them down in front of the police and he's like, I'm here to show that no one's above the law. Unless you're saying that the rich are above the law, then you'll arrest them right now in front of everyone. And he just forces the system to work, and it's like, fucking yeah, man. And then also you've got All-Star Superman.
Yeah,
right?
I'm a big fan of the New 52 Superman, just because I like because I grew up with Unlimited Superman, who was like kind of paranoid from Cadmus, so I already kind of was used to a Superman with more attitude.
Yeah.
So that scratched that itch for me.
And then it allows Batman to be sort of the reserved guy instead of being edgelord.
Yeah.
Because he kind of gets rid of edgelord. But anyway, back to Lex. I think in a world of like Andrew Tate's, it's pretty clear that people like the bald, buff guy who treats women like trash and is obsessed with lying and corruption and just gets away with it. Like, there's a faction of the world that fetishizes that idea. And Zack Snyder said... Yeah, we're gonna get there, but he's a dork. He's a tech bro. He's Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg's bastard baby. And
he's kind of got the Zuckerberg vibes.
The Social Network, man. He was Zuckerberg, which Andrew Garfield crushes in that. We're not going to go into it, but God, what a movie. Sorkin, man. Sorkin can write. Sorkin is the only one I would ever want to see write Jesse's Lex, that if it wasn't going to be Chris Terrio. Those are the only two I would probably ever accept. But you've got this... He basically takes him back to the original pulpy mad scientist era, where he's like sort of quirky, and he's got flamboyant shirts and like colors, and he's very dramatic. But then he goes through that moment, like how Superman has Man of Steel to become Superman. Lex becomes Lex that you know now through Batman versus Superman and into Justice League, whereas he's old school Lex, like the type of Lex Luthor that would have like a purple turtleneck and rocket boots on, mad scientist. And he's like, I saw people being like, why did he make Doomsday? Is he dumb? I'm like, Lex Luthor making a thing that he thinks he can control and then needing to be saved by Superman. It's like the premise of half of the Fleischer Superman cartoons. And it's a lot of the Bruce Timm era Superman cartoons. And it's a lot of comics. That's like a running gag of Lex thinks he's smarter than everyone, overexerts
It's kind of a
himself.
classic of kind of the mad scientist type anyway.
Yeah, which all comes out of the pulp and pulp noir, which Detective Comics was founded in, as like the pulp noir, the Shadow, the Spider, and all that type of stuff. And then, you know, we're not going to get into like...
Did they bring back the Spider in DC as like criminal character?
I know the Batman had a crossover with the Shadow for a couple of comics, but I don't know if... I think that was a separate continuity.
Yeah.
I always just think of Alec Baldwin with that prosthetic nose from the live-action movie of the 90s, which I need to go back and fully watch. I want to watch that in The Phantom, which The Phantom was the first episode of our non-Snyder-centric podcast, where we were like, technically the first Black Panther actually was a white guy, because before they invented Black Panther, there was The Phantom, and very similar premise.
Yep.
But, yeah, you know, I think that kind of bothered people when suddenly they couldn't look up to Lex, even though we all say, like, well, Superman's the good guy, but especially when you look at the way people act online, it's a lot of a version of Superman doesn't act the way they want him to. They want to destroy the whole franchise. Also,
I feel like you've brought this up with me a few times, again, mostly outside of the podcast, but that a lot of people will look at Superman and Lois and be like, this was a great scene, but it will basically be a scene from, like, Man of Steel or something.
Yeah, there's the first time I noticed it was when Captain Luthor had been fighting Superman in armor, which turns out to be steel. Great show. I love that twist. I'm a huge fan of that show, actually, which is why it kills me when people are like, it's so much better. I'm like, I mean, they're both good. They're just different. Like, I like chocolate milk and apple juice.
Also,
I'm not going to drink them at the same time.
I feel like clearly how inspired it is by the Man of Steel.
The showrunner has been open about it. The only thing the showrunner ever said negatively about Zack Snyder was, I mean, I wish he'd had... Basically, he was like, I wish it had been a longer movie so we got more stuff, which is what you get to do in a show or a comic. Yeah. Also, the only criticism being, I wish Man of Steel had an extended cut is my favorite criticism, because I have to agree. I would love an extended cut. I would love extended cuts of, like, Star Wars and stuff. If I like a thing, I want to live in that world longer. Also, the season finale of the most recent Superman and Lois, very Batman versus Superman, because Batman vs. Superman is also very comic booky. So it's just like... It's like their Doomsday design is very similar to the Doomsday in Batman vs. Superman. Their origin of Doomsday is very similar, of like a Kryptonian who gets mutated and turned into a thing to kill him, who he's fought before in the past. And it's like, you have to fight him or die, Superman. And it's Lex Luthor behind it all who wants revenge. And, it's, you know, it's very similar. And I like, which leads me to enjoy both, and then confuses me when either group doesn't like the other version. I haven't seen a whole lot of that Lex Luthor because he wasn't super heavily featured. I don't love the sort of Kingpin thing they're doing, where he's just kind of feels like he's being Wilson Fisk, which is hard to describe until you see the performance, but he's very, like, I could see him being mad that someone embarrassed him in front of Vanessa. It's just all I'll say. But I'm going to give him a fair shake, which is something that most people didn't give anyone else in the Snyder movies. But Originally, Lex Luthor was planned to... We see the tease in the end of Justice League, but he was going to set up a sort of... They were calling it the Injustice League for some stupid reason. Jeff Johns and all the WB people were after Zach left. We're calling it the Injustice League. I'm like, it's the Legion of Doom.
Yeah. Canonically, that's what it's supposed to be.
And and to that point, I know that this is a new canon. They could call it the Super Friends if they wanted and just be real cheeky about it. But it's a little... And there's never been a group called the Injustice League. There's been the Justice Lords. There's been Injustice.
When you have a group of people that really enjoy it, when you stick to the canon of comics, there's no reason not to go with the thing that perfectly fits what you're already making.
Yeah, and the only way I could see is if they were like, oh, well, if they call themselves the Legion of Doom, it kind of implies that they know that they're the bad guys of the story, and every villain thinks he's the hero.
But doesn't the Justice League do the same thing?
Exactly. Also, Legion of Doom could imply, hey, if we don't stop these superheroes, we're doomed. The world is doomed.
Or maybe just, Doomsday was supposed to be my magnum opus, so that in his honor, we're going to finish what he started.
Yeah, the Legion of Doom. That was supposed to be his Doomsday, and it will still come. This is my Legion of Doom. That goes hard, man. I like that. I'm mad, and I like that.
Which adds a lot more weight to him making Doomsday that early on.
Yeah. God. And I want to do a whole podcast episode individually on just why sneaking in the death of Superman so soon was the only way to actually make it impactful.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can't do the Tony Stark thing, because that's actually the end of his story. Mm-hmm. Until Robert Downey Jr. gets broke, which will take probably 10 years, and by then he'll be too old, so it'll make no sense. They've got CGI faces.
That doesn't mean Marvel won't do it.
No, they won't.
I mean, they will still do it if it doesn't make any sense.
It's difficult because every single one of these topics has such a branching conversation that can happen.
Much like with the dialogue of Lex Luthor, there's layers.
And that's sort of, I think, not to bash Marvel, it has sort of a fast food vibe where mostly what's being said is literally all there is to it, and you can enjoy it with a sort of empty mind. It's kind of like hating
McDonald's. It's yes, there are valid things to complain about, but at the same time, you're still going to get McDonald's.
Yeah, and it's successful, and it's consistent, usually.
It's not the healthiest, but it works.
Yeah. And some people will eat McDonald's, and that's their favorite thing. And some people never want to go eat McDonald's, and there's no right or wrong answer to that. Some people want the fast food experience. Some people want to sit down and really dig into a hearty meal.
Do I wish this particular McDonald's would pick up the ball again and quit making bad movies? Yes.
Hey, here's hoping that that Captain America movie's good.
It better be. I'm done with the MCU if they mess up the Captain America movie.
Which is, if people knew much about you, that they would be astonished at that statement.
I've been steadily okay, so this is the movie they're going to get it right. Oh, no, because then I hear it's nope, they didn't. This is the show they're going to get it on track. Nope.
And that's another thing. People complained about, Jesse Eisenberg's Lex isn't like the comic. There's not a single character that, villain-wise, specifically, especially, in Marvel, the MCU, that was adapted where you're yeah, that's exactly from the comic.
Yeah.
Hela
MODOK?
MODOK, Hela, Kang.
MODOK isn't anywhere close.
Ultron, no Hank Pym involved in that at all.
No.
And I get that some of these are concessions of... In comic books, you can have 64 ongoing comics every other week.
I also kind of wish they would have done the return of the different Ultrons, because I think Ultron's an interesting villain and deserved. But that's one of the issues I do genuinely have the MCU, where they kind of trade off a villain, they get one run and that's it.
Yeah, and they just kill him off.
People love Michael B. Jordan's Black Panther as a
Killmonger.
Yeah, Killmonger. People loved his performance in that character. That's why I think they included his character in the whole what if section.
Yeah.
They couldn't write a good what if section for the most part, but they included him.
I liked a few of those episodes.
Where was I?
You went red about the MCU not being accurate in killing off things. But back in Lexland,
right.
I think it's interesting that people have such a bone to pick with Jesse's Lex when you look at Gene Hackman, who has hair for most of his appearances. He goes bald and then puts his hair back on for the rest of the movies. And he's a cartoon character. He's over the top. Even James Gunn hates him and called him corny. And look, I don't think he's wrong. I just think it's funny that James Gunn also spent months constantly Superman the movie debuted this time, best movie ever, and then it was Oh, by the way, yeah, no, I totally hate him. And I guess forgot that he was on a podcast where what he said would be published. The same way when he was promoting The Flash, he's like, it's got Michael Keaton in it. That's all I have to say. Only to find out he hated Michael Keaton and Jack Nicholson. And like, look, I agree. Jack Nicholson kind of just plays himself. I'm not disagreeing with that.
It's a memorable performance, though.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't seen a whole lot of Jack Nicholson content, so when I saw that Joker, I was just like, oh, this is an interesting Joker.
As a kid, it's usually like, oh, yeah, this is a good Joker. But, in my opinion...
It matches up well enough, I think.
I don't disagree that Jack Nicholson was largely playing a Jack Nicholson character. However, I never tried to promote a movie as being, hey, look how good these things are. I'm one of you guys. Accept me now. Ignore the creepy things I did. So that's the big difference. I'm not upset about his opinion on these movies. I mean, I think they're kind of dumb, especially like the Blade Runner slander and Gladiator hate. I don't understand that. Or hating the Nolan trilogy. That one I can't excuse.
Does he just not like good movies?
He doesn't like DC, which is why he's perfect for DC, apparently. I look at all these Lex Luthors, and I look at the plot of like what Lex Luthor did, and I've long thought that if you had Clancy Brown read Lex's dialogue from Batman vs Superman, no one would complain about it. If you had Kevin Conroy read Batman's lines from like, why did you say that name, and like Martha and all that, if it was an animated episode, people wouldn't complain. And in fact, there's even a comic panel from Justice League New Frontier, the whole Darwin Cook comic run, where Superman and Batman are fighting each other, and Batman calls Superman a motherless alien, and Clark looks up and basically is like, you're lucky I've got restraint, pal. And it's basically like, it's very Batman vs Superman, which doesn't mean that it's based on it because it predates it, but it means that Batman vs Superman is steeped in all these comic ideals and themes, and they didn't invent them both having the name Martha for a mom.
I mean, from a writing standpoint, it's easy. People have criticized it to death, but the fact to be able to see, like, yeah, it just so happens they were both given the same name. It's like, well, and having the ability to look at that, it's like, well, what if that's the point that makes Batman realize that he's just a human, like, even though he's an alien, he's still human like him. He still has family. He still has people he's gonna lose.
I mean, even someone as hacky as Joss Whedon was like, oh, hey, that's a good point, and has a whole line of dialogue in the reshoots where Batman's like, Superman was an alien, I hated him, but he was more human than me, because he had a wife or a girlfriend and a mother that loved him, and friends and co-workers, and I don't have any of that. He was more human than me. I'm like, yeah. So even the creepy dum-dum Joss Whedon was like, yeah, that's a good point. These people who criticize these things, people will be like, oh, this was a bad adaptation. But then the comic author of the comics that are being adapted, like Dan Jurgens is like, Batman vs. Superman was a good adaptation of the comic I wrote. That was a good adaptation of Doomsday. Giving him a couple extra powers because he's Zod now was cool, and I liked that.
I also loved the parallels of him killing Superman the way he killed his father.
Jor-El, with a stab through the heart. Yeah.
Like, literally same shot for shot, practically a whole recreation.
Yeah. It's amazing. Larry Fong and... I forgot the name of the cinematographer for Man of Steel, which sucks because I was just talking about him the other day.
You should have it just appear on the screen or whatever.
Yeah, if you're watching, then his name's on the screen. If you're listening, then Google it. But, people complain like, oh, Jesse's bad at this. I'm like, well, all the people whose comics they were adapting said it was good. And if you've ever read Superman Birthright, which is ironically Mark Waid's way of adapting the Smallville version of Lex, it's literally looks and acts just like him. And now in My Adventures with Superman, that new animated series, it's just Voltron with a slap of DC paint over it. It's got, a little sexy teeny boy Slade Wilson now, where he's got, instead of the eye patch, he's got like the floofy hairbang that goes over his face, and it's Jerry from Rick and Morty.
Yeah, that's not the voice I would have gotten for Deathstroke.
No, Ron Perlman was the last one I remember.
It feels like a dating sim version.
Oh no, that's not true. Michael Ironside's voiced Deathstroke in a one-off animated movie. Pretty good. But that version they have Lex Luthor, and it's Lex Luthor Jr., which brought in the whole debate. People like, I forgot Lex canonically had a kid, but it was actually an Australian clone of himself whenever he faked his death. So technically, if Zack Snyder wasn't a hack, I guess he would have adapted Batman versus Superman to have an Australian mullet-having Lex Luthor who's like, "Aye, good eye, Superman.
I mean,
Hope
everyone
you
would have
don't
loved
die."
that. I mean, with how well they reacted to Eisenberg's deviations from the cartoons and whatnot, I'm sure Australian clone.
I genuinely would have loved that. But just because people would have hated it, and you have to be like, well, it's comic accurate. And I have a whole chapter called "Comic Accuracy Isn't Accurate," because it's a moving target. No writer is consistent to, even themselves oftentimes. And, you know, it's that sort of thing where, like, if you grew up and you really liked Smallville, right? And so now you write Lex Luthor like it's Smallville Lex. Now you have to ask yourself, okay, is that comic accurate, or is it accurate to the TV show? And
I mean, with so many different interpretations over the years, of characters have had so many interpretations, it's hard to do.
Harley Quinn wouldn't exist without ignoring comics and just making a character. Mr. Freeze would still be a common, like, thief instead of, like, a tragic character if they hadn't dared to deny comic canon. You know, the inability to allow people to sort of flip the script from time to time is stale and boring, and, like, we wouldn't have a Superman who could fly. We wouldn't have kryptonite. We wouldn't have all these facets.
With how kind of iffy comic book movies were for a while, I can understand people's like, you gotta adhere.
We saw Green Lantern.
Yeah.
But technically Green Lantern followed the comics. It was still shit, though. Like, saying this is like the comic doesn't mean this is a good movie. Because I can find bad comic books. I own plenty of them. So that's kind of the give and take of it. And then I've asked people, like, what's wrong with this Lex Luthor? And they're like, oh, he acts more like the Joker or Riddler. I'm like, well, someone has to, because Matt Reeves wasn't going to let his Riddler act like the Riddler. Which is mostly me just being like, you're really going to argue that this guy's too much like the Riddler when the Riddler is nothing like the Riddler in that movie, and you don't have a problem there. Which is like that weird selective Snyder bias. But he isn't like the Riddler. Like, he isn't leaving riddles for people to solve. He isn't making jokes at people's expense and laughing maniacally.
Yeah.
He isn't acting like the Joker. He just isn't reserved.
The only thing they share is that they're both intelligent people who with a grudge against the world.
Which it could be said of almost every villain.
Both characters just share anyway.
Yeah, fundamentally, that's just a common trait from the comics and animation. And another problem, which you touched on slightly before, was people will be like, this isn't like the cartoon that I watched. Because cartoons, no one likes to admit it, but cartoons and movies are just more popular than comic books are, at least during our lifetime.
And they tend to shape a lot of what comics go on to take.
I guarantee you, if you walked into any given DC office and were like, when you're writing Batman, who do you hear in your head? 80% of them would say Kevin Conroy. Maybe a couple would say like a Michael Keaton or a Christian Bale, you know? And it's like, we're shaped by what we take in, especially when we're young and impressionable. Especially if it's your first encounter with the character. That becomes your sort of touchstone. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they were accurate. Brainiac being from Krypton was a thing they invented for the animated series of Superman. Superman being depowered and causing more collateral damage because he was learning how to use his powers. The first episode opens with him failing to catch a plane for a little bit, grabs like the wings snap off, and it continues to careen through the city and crash through like trees and scrape skyscrapers. And he has to catch it and think fast to sort of establish that this isn't going to be boring. Superman won't have a power that magically fixes it. He's going to have to think quick on his feet, and he's going to be outsmarted and outclassed in power consistently. But Brainiac being from Krypton was great because it's like, oh, this guy is responsible for why I don't have my birth parents. And it makes it personal, the same way that Burton made it where Jack Napier killed the Waynes, which then Schumacher was going to make it where Batman just keeps hallucinating every villain he fights was the one who killed his parents, to sort of explain, like, that's his, like, mania. Like, literally when he goes to sleep at night, he sees Scarecrow or Penguin or Riddler killing his parents, and that's, like, literally what drives him to fight them.
That's interesting.
It's, like, a very literal manifestation of him trying to fight to save his parents, which the animated series does with the Scarecrow toxin thing. Or that might have been Justice League proper at that point, where he gets gassed, but then he gets up and he punches the Scarecrow. You remember the episode, right? Where he gets gassed, but then he, like, overcomes his fears. So, like, comic accuracy isn't actually a good excuse to complain about stuff, especially since a lot of our comics are written by people who grew up watching animated shows and movies and are therefore not even copying that.
I mean, look at games and shows like The Batman or the Arkham series, who did...
The Batman meaning the cartoon, not the movie, just for the listeners.
That intentionally did deviations with their designs and stuff.
I love that Joker.
Yeah, loved that.
I love their Riddler, their Clayfaces, I guess, technically.
They made Killer Croc Louisiana. Like, he's got like a Louisiana accent.
Which is, I mean, he is supposed to be like from the Bayou. He's a Bayou boy.
Which is fun. And he's kind of got a biker gang vibe.
Yeah, it's cool.
It's interesting.
And those are things that we wouldn't have gotten.
And then you go to the Arkham Asylum version of Killer Croc that's basically a serial killer slasher type who's just... Yeah. They introduce him
like
in
Jason
the intro.
Voorhees.
They introduce him in the intro. Everyone's got their guns pointed at him, and he like walks towards you and threatens you before the shot caller makes him walk away. And it's like, I'll get you. I'll feast on your bones.
Yeah, people subconsciously have basically like a backyard where here's our fence, and as long as you stay within my area, you're fine. So there's not a fixed point that you have to keep doing. There is an area, but it's a different layout and a different square footage for every single person. And if you throw your ball and it goes over that fence for that person, they're going to complain about it. But it's not their movie.
It's kind of like, because now I'm thinking into the Arkham series, like with the Arkham Knight or any other time that Batman comics have tried to introduce a new villain, which is really hard to do because he has such a popular and well-known rogues gallery.
Yeah, especially when there's so many differences across so many comics. And I'm actually going to give... I just saw the design for Brainiac and the design for Zod for My Adventures with Superman. I'm going to be honest, they go fucking hard, dude.
Really?
Yeah. They're like super... Like, they don't look anything like the characters have ever looked. If you hadn't told me that's what they were, I would not have known that's what these characters are. There's almost no visual, design callback at all. But I have no problem with that because the designs by themselves are fucking rad. And I'm like, okay... Look, I think the show is writing Shazam and calling him Superman with how, sort of childish and out of his depth and timid and, just very wet behind the ears they're writing him. He doesn't seem like an adult to me.
I remember a line in one of the DC Universe animated movies where I think it's the one where they're going, I think it's Crisis on Two Earths, where President Slade Wilson is like, you want us to go against the Justice... are they called they're not Justice Lords in that one. They're
the Crime Syndicate, right?
Crime Syndicate.
They are in the comics anyway.
Yeah, I think that's right. You want us to go against the Syndicate? You see what the powers they are. It's like we can't face people that much more powerful than us. And Superman just says, "Sir, I face people more powerful than me every day." And it's like, yeah. Everyone he fights basically beats the snot out of him for a bit, and then he stops them.
Yeah.
And I like that kind of mentality where he's like, I know there are things, there are limits to all the powers I have, which is fun because then it's another dichotomy of, Lex is someone who can never accept his weaknesses and constantly wants more power and validation, whereas Superman is someone who understands for all of his power he's far from perfect.
Yeah.
He's still human, quote-unquote, which makes him better at being human than Lex in a lot of ways.
He displays the best attributes of humanity despite technically not being of Earth. Which makes him a really interesting character. And then Lex, like you said, is human, but sort of refuses to accept the basic flaws innate to humanity.
And in Unlimited, having Lex being obsessed with, becoming fused with Brainiac again because of how powerful he was kind of cements the fact, he's losing the ability to appreciate being human. He doesn't even want to be human anymore.
Because the way I used to really like Lex being written was, he was like, my dad was a great man, at least, accomplishment-wise. I'm going to be better. I'm the best. I am going to change the world. And in another universe, he would have. He would have been the man of tomorrow. He would have been the guy who saved the planet. But Superman showed up, and he happened to land on a planet where the sunshine gives him superpowers. And that's cheating, and that isn't fair. And now I'm going to kill him so everyone knows that it's stupid that sunshine gives you power when I earned all of mine, but at the same time he was bragging about his inherent genius that he had. So he's a walking hypocrite, and he's just this he's got this one buzzing fly around his head, and he uses that as the excuse to go way off the deep end. Which ironically, people who hate Zack Snyder's stuff will use. There's no underpants. He didn't smile enough. I didn't like this, that, or that. And this one thing that I refuse to get over from 8 or 10 years ago is the reason that I can fly off the handle and call you a slur and say that, like, and do all these horrible things. And as much as we joke that, like, we're the cult, like, I saw someone say, James Gunn, our fearless leader, will lead us to new heights. I'm like, that's actual cult talk. Also, statistically, he's made one movie that is the greatest box office bomb of all of DC's history, and that's a history that includes Green Lantern and Catwoman, because his budget was higher, so he lost more. And also betting on the guy who just fell from grace from Marvel and then advertising it as from the horrible, like, wonderful mind of the guy who made all of those gross tweets. Terrible marketing. Like, even if you like the guy, who at Warner Brothers, that's got to be a double agent. Like, someone there was like, dude, fuck this guy, and was just sabotaging. It's like, no, dude, bro, it's totally a good PR plan. Just swing into it. And then it worked somehow. But yeah, it's
somehow Palpatine has returned.
But yeah, that's the thing. It's like, I look at Lex Luthor and sort of laugh at the similarities of diehard, quote, true DC fans and the way that they act precisely like him. DC is their metropolis. Superman has to do what they want, or they'll make their own Superman, their own cyborg Superman, a la the animated edition, not the comics.
That actually brings me back to one of the other things I was thinking when we were talking about Doomsday and Lex Luthor, which was the fact of, like, the sort of the unique dynamic he has with the version of Superman that, like, sometimes he's from a mirror world and talks backwards. What's his name? Bizarro.
Who is the source of Doomsday and Superman and Lois.
Because I think there are versions in which I believe he makes Bizarro.
Yeah, there are. And I think New 52, he was a rushed clone of Superman that they decanted early, and so he's like, ugh.
And it's interesting because even though he sees him as a failure, there are times when, like, he gets
parental.
Like, yeah, and that's interesting. I like that dynamic where it's like,
yeah, he tells him, like, I used to be scared of the dark too, and, like, he opens up almost like a parent or a brother.
And that's a fun, almost redemption arc for him, considering he kind of blames his father even before, like, Snyder's influence in there. He didn't like his father that much. There's sort of a resentment there. He
kills his dad in Smallville, which is funny because people who complain about John Kent's death in Man of Steel, which the guy who played Lionel Luthor is one of those people. I was like, dude, do you remember how your character died? Like, how John Kent's character dies in your show? He tried to kill you, and his seething bloodlust was so extreme that he had a heart attack from hatred trying to protect his son's, like, secret identity. He hated you so much that it killed him. And that's established in the first episode. It's like, you can't take this truck from a Luthor. Like, it's pre-established. And look, honestly, based. I'm totally fine with the John... That's exactly how a Midwestern farmer would act. Stubborn, stuck in his old ways, protective as hell, and willing to get the shotgun to scare off the varmints. Type of... That's a good characterization, and it's not far off from the way he's been depicted in most continuities. Even going back to before John and Martha Kent were called John and Martha Kent. Because the Siegel and Schuster didn't even originally call them that. So, I always think it's funny when people are like, oh, this is bad. I'm like, sir, you were in Batman and Robin as the guy who makes Bane and gets killed by Poison Ivy. And you played the Lionel Luthor whose son was dating a high schooler when he was 35. And then showed up in Shazam to be killed by the 7 Deadly Sins.
That's the version of Bane that goes bomb. Yeah. As he places bombs
around. Simpleton Bane. Honestly, they could have just made it where that was like a big bodybuilder protector that she just charmed, and it doesn't change anything. It's just like, yeah, he was a bodybuilder, and I doped him up full of Ivy juices. To further
sell the example of, like, movie shaping stuff, I didn't know as a kid that Bane was supposed to be smart for a large part of my life.
He can outsmart Batman, breaks his back.
I didn't realize
stories.
that he was the one, like, I believe he deduces his secret identity.
Yeah. And he's a huge threat, and it's he and Slade Wilson were like the two people who were consistently like a physical and mental match. There wasn't really other villains in his repertoire that were both.
That's another thing, is I feel like we haven't gotten in recent media nearly as many good depictions of characters like those, where, like, obviously the Nolan trilogy did a smart and intelligent Bane, which was probably our most recent example of, like, a really good Bane.
Again, to quote Harvey Dent, The night is always darkest just before the dawn, and dawn is coming. I love that line, and I think it perfectly encapsulates the hero's journey that all these stories encapsulate. And Lex Luthor has sort of a darker version of that, of like he thinks he's won and then he fails. I mean, he actually kills Superman on his first ever attempt, which is like I can't name another Lex Luthor that's done that isn't just like a one-off Elseworld, which is kind of cool. Um, and then you're like, okay, he killed Superman on his first attempt. What's his next play? Like, where does he go from there?
Mm-hmm.
What is he like? What happens when the
And
Legion of
not
Doom?
to mention that like scene when setting up the Legion of Doom is like how he just kind of like here he's back, he's risen from the dead, and he's just like taking it in stride at this point.
He's like, I'll just kill him again. He's like, you know what? I'm smarter than ever. I'm more focused than ever. This is gonna be easy, and it sets up that sort of like almost playful, like, hey Superman, remember when I killed you? Remember when I captured your mommy? Wow, good times. And for Christ's sake, if you can get Dwight from The Office to voice Lex Luthor in the new 52 inspired animated cartoons, you can accept Jesse Eisenberg, who, again, I think you see the range he has from Batman vs. Superman to that brief instance in Justice League. You're like, what was coming next?
Mm-hmm.
And it's, there's like storyboards of him in the Nightmare universe with what remains of the Legion of Doom and what remains of the Justice League fighting a two-pronged war against Superman and Darkseid. And what is that like? What does that even entail, right? Like Mad Max, but with like mech suits that Lex designs, and the Black Manta ship that maybe flies now because the oceans have been dried up for the most part. And is Cheetah still around? Would she have been part of it? Is Captain Cold was supposed to be part of it? How much of the Suicide Squad is there? Imagine this Michael Bay's Nightmare Suicide Squad. Tell me that wouldn't be balls to walls crazy. And that's like the pain of like there was so much left on the table and you closed the restaurant before I could finish my meal. I'm hungry. You know?
I remember at one point pitching it would be great to have seen them launch the Nightmare universe into crossing over with the Mortal Kombat movie.
Ed Boon wanted Nightmare Batman and Mortal Kombat. I want to say starting with X, but it could have just been 11. I don't want to misspeak on that, but it was one of them. And his profile used to be a split half Scorpion, half Nightmare Batman combo for a profile picture. So I've seen people like, oh, he's putting Peacemaker in it. He's like a James Gunn show. I'm like, NetherRealm Studios is owned by Warner Brothers Games. Warner Brothers Games gets to decide what goes in. Who's in charge of DC right now? James Gunn. Of course he put his favorite character in the game. It's not rocket science. It's
There's
office
an insane
politics.
amount of like really out there characters in the.
As much as I hate James Gunn, and like, I say that, I hate the way he acts, and I wish he would just turn his life around. Because I would love nothing more than to turn an enemy into a friend in a redemption arc. So, like, I'm one of those people, like, I'm a bad cultist. Because I'm not, we joke it's a cult, but I'm not actually like, blindly like, if I see this symbol, that means I hate you. I see this symbol, it means I like you. Sometimes people who like Snyder movies, I don't particularly get along with. Several of them and I are mutually blocked online because I was just sick of it. And there are people who I like who like James Gunn movies, and I'm like, that's fine. That's not a big deal to me. I don't personally jive with it, but whatever, man. So Peacemaker being in it doesn't really rub me any way. I mean, it's dumb, but it's just workplace nepotism. I'm kind of used to that. I could go down a route about go ahead and look at James Gunn's wife, her filmography before and after dating him, and how suddenly she's in more movies than Batman or Superman in that universe, and is surviving the reboot somehow. But we won't chase that. I'll just say that I really appreciate the way that Jesse Eisenberg's Lex Luthor plays off that fake friend that is magnanimous and loves you and just looking out for you, Metropolis, but in reality is just serving a specific vendetta and the childhood trauma he never got over and clearly hates his father and has not resolved it, and it's resulted in a lot of poor life choices that will make him lose his role in a company. And that's all I'll say, and it definitely has nothing to do with the other thing that I will not talk about. But I think that's a great villain, and I truly believe that it is a horrible person. Great writing, Chris Terrio. Where do you get your inspiration? Also, I don't know if you guys noticed, but we do have a link in the description to every one of these videos to the Autumn Snyder Tribute Fund over at AFSP, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. So if you do have the means, feel free to click on it or just go there and donate what little you can. It's always nice to help. Everyone has a bad day, but it shouldn't be their last day. So thank you for listening and for just sticking along. The end.